Now in this video, I want to show you how to research a stock really quickly. I'm going to use SPLITIT as an example because I still don't know much about it. And I just wanted to let you know that I'm not going to edit this video too much. And at the same time, this is a process that I usually use before I commit in more time to research the company to see whether I want to invest in it. So think of this more as a preliminary research to see if you want to put in more time. And I'll talk about my process and then we'll go through the process ourselves. And then towards the end, I will make an observation to see whether I will invest in more time to dig into the company to see whether it's worthwhile investing in. Now, first things first, when it comes to the research process, especially during this stage, I want to keep it pretty simple. One, I want to understand how the business makes money. Two, I want to understand the numbers they've been able to produce so far. And three, the co-founders, their ownership structure within the management team, because that's really, really important to me. I prefer a co-founder-led company. When it comes to the first step, all we're really trying to do is just to find out how it makes money. And the easiest way to do this is either via investor presentations, any kind of YouTube videos where the CEO talks about the company. And if you're really nerdy, we can read the IPO prospectus. So let's do this together. I normally like to just go to Google and then type in the company presentation, investor presentation. Okay. ASX.com usually have the most reliable source of information. So that's really where I always go. So especially for growth companies. And then if we go to more announcements, what we're looking for here is some kind of presentation. So this one could do, and also investor update. Okay, that one could do too. So give me a second as I scroll through this, because there is statistics, but what we're really looking for here is just how they make money. So give me a second as I look through the document. Okay, so I think I found something here. So the good thing about growth companies, especially early stage, is they'll dedicate multiple slides on talking about how the business makes money and I guess the different steps to making money, which is great. And it seems like the process is largely the same between Zip and Afterpay. You choose the payment method at the very end, at the checkout, split it into multiple payments. But it seems like the main difference here is that instead of going through a credit check or some kind of application process, you just use your Visa or MasterCard. And then assuming that there is 0% interest for the consumers, SPLITIT will take a transaction cut from the merchant, which is what they said over here. And I think the transaction costs on the merchant side is dependent on what the consumers choose when it comes to the number of installments. Now in that case, we have a pretty good idea of how to make money, but give me a second, let me see if there's anything else that we need from this document here. This is probably also really important. So they talked about the addressable market, which essentially just means that how big is the market that they can sell into. And similar to other buy now, pay later type companies, of course, they're going to be in e-commerce. They want to move into retail sales. And this is pretty standard, to be honest, cart abandonment rate. Now, the thing to remember here is that when it comes to cart abandonment, a lot of consumers nowadays are actually pretty smart. So they'll purposely abandon the cart knowing that they're going to get emails or some kind of retargeting with better discounts, etc. So even though it's saying it's a massive number, just take it with a grain of salt because it's people are pretty smart nowadays. Okay, so this is also really important. Now, as you can see, the average order value is about $700, which is a lot, by the way. Afterpay is about $150. Zip Money is a little bit more than that. So when it comes to SPLITIT's, I guess, consumer base, they're purchasing pretty expensive products. And because the average order value is so high, you don't really expect the customers to keep coming back to buy some more. So then really the way to increase your revenue is to have more merchants and then more sales volume instead of expecting the consumers to buy multiple times to recoup the money that you spent on acquiring them. And I think in some future documents, we're going to find some kind of growth rate on the number of merchants. And what's MSV? Hold on, give me a second. Oh, okay. So MSV is merchant sales volume. So I anticipate that with some of the other documents we're going to look in just a second, they're going to talk about the total merchants, essentially the growth rate on the merchants and also sales volume, because that's probably where their revenue is tied towards. Now, another way to understand how the business make money is to basically go to their website. So Let's try that. And okay, so seems like there is a section for just how it works. And it seems like it applies to both credit cards and debit cards. So I guess it's largely the same. Okay, cool. I think that's all we need in terms of understanding the business and the market it operates in. I think one of the last things we need to look for is some of the key risks inside the business. Now, for whatever reason, they don't talk extensively about the risks inside this business, especially in the investor updates. One of the easiest way to find the key risks is to look at the IPO prospectus. So let's quickly find that prospectus. Oh, whoops. So I'm gonna split it. Then to shortcut this, we always just want to search for key risk. There should be section. Oh, here. Just for your own sanity's sake, I usually like to just read through this part right here, because as part of the IPO prospectus, they have to document very extensively what are some of the key risks. Now, I don't have no proof on this, but the higher up the risk, the more dominant the risk, if that makes sense. So if merchant relationship is mentioned first, that's usually obviously a really high risk to the company. I have no proof of that, but I think it makes sense here, just because the revenue numbers from SPLITIT is tied towards merchants and merchant sales volume. So I can understand why that's such a big deal and big risk as well. So that's number one. And that's obvious as well. And that's probably tied towards merchants, of course. Laws. There's always compliance laws with fintech. Failure or disruption to the oh, okay. So if you watched my Zip Money video, I actually talked about how, because these buy now pay later companies are dependent on the checkout infrastructure to acquire brand new customers. Now the good thing is the checkout infrastructure has no monopoly. Even though Shopify owns a big chunk of it, everyone who's on Shopify have to use their checkout infrastructure. And the good thing is there's also Magento and a bunch of other players. So there isn't a monopoly when it comes to the checkout infrastructure. And in that video, I actually talk about if you take the infrastructure away and you remove the buy now pay later players, they're gonna have a very tough time acquiring brand new customers. So yeah, so this is definitely one of the key risks, because Shopify has already started offering something that's exactly the same as Afterpay. It's called Shop Pay, and 4 installments, interest-free, exactly the same. So this is definitely a key risk as well. Protection and ownership of intellectual property. Intellectual property. Did they have patents? Okay, so they have patents. Now, I'm not going to Google the patents, but I might look into it after the video. If any of you know extensively what those patents are, let me know in the comment section below, because I would love to know what have they patented in the business, because that will ultimately add to the competitive advantage for the company. Reputational damage, that's an obvious one. When it comes to additional requirement for capital for growth companies, you almost want to assume that they can raise capital, because if they can't, it's almost unlikely that they can survive unless they go for profitability earlier rather than later. So I'm gonna put my optimistic hat on. I'll try not to be too biased, but with most growth companies, I assume that you can survive, at least in the short term, because they're only being public for about a year. Competitors, of course, there's a lot of copycats in buy now pay later space currently, so that's standard. Data protection and security breaches. This is another one that I don't really know much about when it comes to Israeli law and I don't know much about Israeli legislations and how that will affect an Australian company, if you will. But what I do know is that in the startup world, Israel has a really good reputation in terms of great companies, great people. So again, if any of you know extensively how Israeli legislation might affect SPLITIT's operations here in Australia, let me know in the comment section below. But I think that's all I really need. I think the most dominant risk is the merchant relationship. You almost have to convince merchants that, hey, instead of using Zip and Afterpay, try us. Less merchant fees. But I guess the key question is, will the consumers try SPLITIT? Because that's a very expensive A/B test for the merchants. Considering at this point they really need the revenue. Yeah, this is going to be a tough one. Not even the loss of key merchant relationships. It's more like acquiring merchants. So I think that's really all we need. I have done checklists for you for sanity's sake. I usually have a checklist on top of my head when I do research for these companies, and I usually just check them off mentally as I go through them. But you know, if you're still new trying to understand how to research companies, I created a checklist for you so you can just tick them off as you go. So I think we have a pretty good understanding of how the business make money. They make money via they make money via the merchants. The consumers don't pay anything. And then the markets it's currently operating in is mostly e-commerce, and they want to move into retail. And when it comes to the key risks, I think the most dominant risk is the number of merchants that they can onboard and acquire. Instead of losing the merchant, I think the key risk is more acquiring the merchants and of course keeping the merchants. If they can do that, if they can acquire the merchants and then keep them, I think they can grow pretty fast. But let's keep digging. Okay, so the second step is really kind of digging into the numbers, and you want to see what kind of numbers they have been able to produce. And you also want to know whether they have enough assets to survive long enough to experience the growth. And we'll finish off this section with looking at business specific metrics as well. So one of the easiest way I like to do this is to go to Yahoo Finance. You can use whatever you're comfortable with. I personally use Yahoo Finance or simply Wall Street. Okay, so if you look at their financials, because they've only been public for about a year, there isn't that much information to go off. So we'll probably need to go back to the investor presentation to see what else is useful when it comes to financials on those presentations. So we'll go back to the investor presentations. Give me a moment to look for useful slides. Okay, so I found it. The most useful slides is this one. And also, I'll talk about this one first and then I'll go into the next presentation. Remember, when it comes to SPLITIT, they're very dependent on merchant sales volume. And obviously, the more sales that the merchant does on, the more SPLITIT is going to make money. And merchant sales volume is specifically tied to sales that's done on the merchant side that SPLITIT has taken a cut. So obviously, the more sales volume it does, the more money SPLITIT is going to make. And it's really good to see that the first 3 months has been a little bit quiet. And then on the April and May, it has definitely skyrocketed. Well, the pandemic has obviously helped when it comes to the growth. But let's look at another slide. And this is pretty useful. When it comes to business specific metrics, for SPLITIT, because the average order value is $700, you don't expect people to keep purchasing $700 worth of products every couple of months. So it's probably more important to look at the number of merchants that's using SPLITIT. And as we can see, since they've gone public, they've definitely really grown the number of merchants, which is really good to see. I think the most important thing is to focus on the total of merchants, and they've definitely grown their total of merchants by, well, almost 100%. And it's good to see that the revenue has also grown by 100%. Really, really good to see. When it comes to 12-month active shoppers and repeat shoppers, I think what we need to pay attention to here is, if you remember in the Zip and Afterpay video, I talk a lot about customer retention. That's mainly because you want to know whether customers actually love this product, and the more they use it, the more they love it. But because the average order value is very high for SPLITIT, you don't really expect the shoppers to keep purchasing. So I'll still pay attention to this because I want to know whether SPLITIT can become a preferred way of purchasing things from e-commerce stores. But at the same time, I don't expect repeat shoppers to kind of skyrocket from here. The next thing we should look for is the current ratio and the amount of cash to their liabilities. That's mainly because I want to know whether they can survive in the short term to experience the growth. The worst thing is not being able to live to see it, essentially. So if we go back to Yahoo Finance, you go to their balance sheet. Current ratio is just the current liabilities divided by, the current assets divided by the current liabilities. Now, as you can see, so if we do 24,962 divided by 2088, for every $1 of current liabilities, there is about $12, $11.9 worth of current assets. Now, the reason why we want to pay attention to this is these current assets are basically things that you can sell off within the next 12 months to turn it into cash, very liquid assets. And current liability means that when the creditors come to your door and starts knocking, these are the people you need to pay first. So seeing that there is about 12 times coverage, it means that they should be able to withstand any kind of shocks within the short term and be okay with it. It's even better if you look at the number of cash, if you look at the amount of cash, so let's say 16,000, because total cash, 16,657, and then you divide that over by current liabilities and non-current liabilities. So you go 2088 plus, there's a decimal here by the way, so it's 148, and the cash covers the liabilities by almost 7 times, which is really good to see. It means that even if they can't sell off some of the other assets in time, they can use the cash to pay off some of the liabilities. Really good to see. So now that we've gone through some of the revenue growth, current ratios, and the more business specific metrics, I usually like to tick them off in my head as I go through my research. And it seems like from a revenue standpoint, it's doing pretty good, but that's like every other growth company that it grows at 100%. That's pretty standard. For current ratios, it's looking pretty good. They have enough current assets to well cover their current liabilities and the non-current liabilities. Amount of cash they have is also really good. It's more than enough to withstand any shocks in the short term. So from a numbers standpoint, pretty healthy, I would say. Now the last thing, and definitely not least, is looking at the management team. When it comes to the management team, I try and focus on the co-founders because that's really where everything starts. And it's a personal preference that I prefer a co-founder-led company only because no one is going to work harder than a co-founder. Because with an early stage growth company, this is their baby, this is their life's work. And I just don't think anyone is going to work harder than the co-founder. They will do literally whatever it takes, especially if they have high ownership stakes. It means that this will keep them in check to not do anything stupid, to just benefit and grow their own net worth, but to grow the company instead. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule in terms of their relevant experience, but it really does help. So we'll dig into that in just a second. And I also want to know who else owns a big stake in the company, mainly because when a startup or when an early stage growth company are not predominantly owned by the co-founders, it means that the investors have a big say in the direction of the company. And personally speaking, and correct me if I'm wrong, but sometimes the investors just don't have the experience the co-founders have in solving the problem. Because unless you're in that world solving the problem day in, day out, you just really don't see how everything works. Now, that might sound controversial, but I've seen that happen with other startups in my little experience in the startup world. So it's just more of a personal preference thing. When a co-founder doesn't own ownership, like a big ownership stake in a startup, I'm more sensitive towards that. So let's look at their management team. One of the easiest way to kind of look at their management team is just go to the website and then, so give me a second. I'm going to fast forward this part while I go find that. Okay, so I think I found it. Now, this is interesting because there's one co-founder. Where's the other one? Co-founder for SPLITIT. It's okay for a co-founder to step down, but it doesn't really say in terms of what happened to him. And will take up a new position as general manager for Europe. Is he actually still? Let's go on LinkedIn and stalk people. Look, if you're gonna invest in a company, you do whatever it takes. You cold call them, you do whatever you need to. Okay, so we'll go. I'm gonna stalk him. So the co-founder is not on the board. What's going on here? All right. So you have one out of the two co-founders left on the board. And it seems like the CEO is obviously really experienced from Intuit, PayPal, and Visa. So which is good. Worked in payment companies. And of course the chairman is strong. But that's kind of a warning sign to me. Because really no one's gonna work harder than the co-founder. Let's dig a little deeper, and I'm gonna fast forward this part here, because let's dig into the ownership structure and see who owns the company, how the percentage of ownership, etc., etc. So give me a second as I fast forward this part. Okay, so I think I have enough information here, and it's getting a little dark, so I'm gonna try and wrap up this video soon. Now, it seems like the ownership structure is a little bit convoluted. Now you have Victoria Crane and her family fund business, if you will, venture Vest Partners. They own about almost 16% of the company. That's massive. And the co-founders only own about 11. That's a big issue in my opinion. Now, I don't know your views when it comes to this, but because I personally worked at a startup, we went through multiple rounds, and as we got deeper and deeper into rounds, I experienced the lack of control coming from our co-founders because of how many shares the investors have owned. This is a big problem only because no one understands the environment and the business better than the co-founders. And when you give away too much control, sometimes investors want a return. You know, they're not really your best friends, if you will. They have other people they answer to, and they need a return on that, which is absolutely fair. And in scenarios like these, when co-founders have given up too much control of the company, you can't really run the company the way you want to anymore, because if it doesn't generate returns, you're essentially going to get kicked out. And whether that did happen to Gil, who knows? But obviously they have a professional CEO on the board now, and this is the co-founder along with Gil, and there's only about 11% ownership. So Victoria and Venture Vest and the chairman basically can tell them exactly what to do and how to operate. I don't necessarily think that's a really good way of, to start a company. And yeah, I personally don't like that at all, to be honest. That's a bit of a deal breaker for me. And if we go back to the slides, their relevant experience and who else owns a big stakes in them. I think we just talked about all of them in just, in a very short amount of time. It's a personal preference that I prefer co-founder-led companies. It doesn't mean that it's right. I just from my own experience working at startups, meeting with co-founders, and also some of the, unicorns in Sydney and Australia, no one's going to work harder than a co-founder. And because you're in the trenches so much, the co-founders almost know the environment better than anyone else. Now, obviously, I'm biased because I'm speaking from startup environments, but this is really important to me. And when it comes to the relevant experience, that's not really that important because you can always, learn it on the job. And just from, reading about the company, it seems like most people are really experienced in this space anyway. And in credit card companies or banking, and it just seems like, they're well equipped. But one of the co-founders not being on the board, that's, a big warning sign to me. And yeah, that's definitely a deal breaker for me. And especially who else owns big stakes in them. Yeah, I mean, personally, I just don't think the co-founders can make the best, strategic decision, if you will, because you always have to ask for permission at this point. So yeah, so that's definitely a deal breaker for me. After doing all that, I usually have a checklist I guess a mental model that I tick every time I go through my research process. And I personally prefer that it's co-founder led, and if they have the experience to solve the particular problem the company is trying to solve, great. If not, not a biggie. And when it comes to ownership structure, again, I prefer that co-founder have a higher stake than everyone else, only because you want that skin in the game. You want them to be motivated, and no one really is going to work harder than a co-founder, honestly. So this is a checklist I go through when it comes to management team. As long as the co-founders are exceptional and they understand how to build a great product and they're aggressively chasing after market share, they can attract some very good people. Now, unless you have that, it's very hard to go recruit people for your management team. Here is my observations, okay? Now, the thing is, if you're going to decide whether you want to invest in them, earlier in the video, I mentioned that this is a process I use to decide whether I want to commit more time to research a company and then ultimately decide to invest in them. But the thing to remember here is that with most growth companies, it's very hard to tell whether if it's expensive or not, because everything is priced on future sentiment. And granted that we have a pandemic going on and everything is kind of favoring the buy now, pay later space, the decision you really have to make to whether to commit more time is, given what you know about the business so far, what do you think the business can become in the future? That's really a question you have to ask for yourself. Because ultimately, you need to be comfortable with the decision you make. And the way I like to think about it is, can I sleep at night knowing that I bought into this company at this particular price? Less so, the price is less important to me, but more in terms of what I believe the future prospect to be for the company. Now, so far, the company has done some pretty great things. The number of merchants they've been able to onboard it, great. The revenue growth, incredible. And the business model is quite different compared to everyone else. And the partnership that they struck with MasterCard and also Stripe, it's saying that, it's essentially showing glimpses of its promise and what it can become in the future. But the issue I have with this company is the ownership structure. Having such a large stake owned by another investment company and individual investors, if you will, I'm not really okay with that. That's a bit of a deal breaker for me, because I much prefer a co-founder led business, and I much prefer the co-founders having a higher stake than everyone else on the table. That's because when you lose control, especially in an early stage company, you're not really making the best decision for the company anymore. Like who knows? Like, the investors need a return at the end of the day, and you might make it. Ultimately, the decision making process is almost swayed towards how can you make the most returns out of this investment the investors put in, because you can't tell me any investors are willing to just lose all their money. I highly doubt it. So giving investors so much control, I don't think that's good for the company. And not having a co-founder led business, I mean, I can understand it if he or she is not great at leading the business, but most of the time co-founders will work harder than every single other person in the team. And yeah, that's a deal breaker for me. So these 3 steps really is a very brief research process I go through before I decide I want to commit more time in researching the stock, and then decide whether I want to invest into it. So hopefully this has been really helpful. This is one of the bonus videos. So if you enjoyed this, make sure you gently smash the like button, and that would mean the world to me. And for the rest of the week, everything is going to be usual. So all the usual videos on both Thursdays and Sundays, they're still coming. I just want to release a bonus video. So make sure you subscribe to my channel, click onto the bell. When those videos are ready, you'll be the first one to know. And until next time, my name is David, and see you very, very soon.